It's a pleasure to be here in Birmingham today, right in the heart of this country. And thanks to Matt and our hosts, ProBrand, an important partner for Kaspersky. So I want to spend the next 30 minutes talking to you about the imperative of business transformation and how, in essence, that burns boundaries within our organizations and exposes us to risk. So we know that we have to do this, but we also know that we have a responsibility to manage greater risk and posture. And I would say, really what I want to do are three things. So set some of the context to the need for transformation, just paint a picture about the environment, the landscape that we see today. Then I want to talk about some of the threats that we're all seeing. And then I want to do, I suppose, some rescue at the end, which is, this is, as Matt says, if we don't know that we've been breached, in all likelihood we have been, how do we then recover? What tools are available to us to help navigate that process and get us back on a better footing? So I want to help bring that to life with a couple of case studies, two market sectors. I'm sure many of you hear from both of these sectors, but financial services, no stranger to disruption, and healthcare services. So two services we all consume, very close to our hearts. So I want to talk about a couple of case studies just to help expose and shine a light on some of the risks that we face. So just to set the scene a little bit, we live in what I can only describe as a hyper-connected world. I think, whilst we look at some of the benefits of technology and what it has conferred on us, cloud, for example, the corollary of that greater flexibility in our business has also been exposing us to increased risk. Cloud Industry Forum says that 62% of businesses wanting to extend into the cloud, security is their #1 concern. So we can see the benefits that it confers. We're all very familiar with the increased risk that we expose ourselves to as a result. I'm glad I wasn't the first person to mention GDPR, but I could be the first person to mention Brexit. We have various, and this is not about geopolitics, by the way, but we live in an increasingly uncertain time. We have all sorts of existential threats in our business. And these 2 points together, that backdrop of continued uncertainty, continued need to change, exogenous factors that we have no control over, necessitates that transformation and that it is done in a compliant way and in a way that is cognizant of some of the threats, many of which we can only begin to imagine. So 12 months ago, ransomware wasn't really in the public consciousness. That changed last year, as we saw with Petya, WannaCry, and so on. So who knows what's going to happen in the future? It's an arms race. That threat will continue to emerge. And I think finally, everything is faster, or maybe that's just what happens as I get older, but everything seems to happen at extreme speed. And it's frankly, quite exhausting to try and keep on top of that. So we have this backdrop and landscape. And I think in terms of, what we would know as business as usual, that doesn't really exist anymore. And I think the thing about disruption that we see now is that it is so left field. We don't know where our competitors will come from. It could be anywhere globally, offering an enhanced proposition to our clients, offering a much lower cost base. And again, this is driving that left field nature of the disruption that we see is driving the need for transformation in our business at a much quicker rate. So that competition is a reality, and I think the need for us to differentiate what we do and how we deliver better outcomes to our clients as we deliver this transformation is critical for all of us in this room. So what is transformation? When we talk about transformation and digital transformation specifically, what do we mean? Well, every business will have, I think, 3 choices that they need to consider as you go through this process. You want to develop better innovation, better speed to market, better relevance of your proposition. You will typically have a choice of whether you buy or you build that into your organization. You need to have transformed relationships. This requires, and really this is where a lot of the cyber threat will come from, but you need to grant trust in a different way to organizations that you partner with and organizations that you wish to authenticate your services to. And I'll talk a little bit about this when we get to Payment Services Directive 2, open banking in one of the case studies I want to talk about. So I think these transformed relationships introduce third parties and mechanisms for threat to find its way into the organization. So fundamentally, transformation requires that we break down barriers. But by breaking down barriers, we're taking those benefits, but we're also introducing increased threat. And supply chain is typically where we see that. Okay, so talking about some of the market sectors, just to sort of give some context to this. So banking, financial services is undergoing a huge disruption. Payment Services Directive 2, which I'm sure many of you in the room are familiar with, but as consumers, what is the benefit to us? It is the promise of open banking. It is the promise of frictionless engagement with the financial services that we consume, so better outcomes for us as individuals. But what that does, in a globally functioning market, is introduce increased cyber threat. So to produce a better customer experience, we have to introduce new third parties into this organization. So we have to grant that trust, as I said earlier, to new organizations to provide payment initiation services, better administration of our accounts, if we are to take advantage of all the benefits that open banking confers. So what this means is you see much more sophisticated techniques. Obviously, I'm sure we're all well aware with the social engineering aspect of threat, the phishing aspect of threat. You're introducing new threat vectors as you undergo that transformation. And I think, essentially, fintechs are tech companies with banking licenses, right? They have, as we've seen, obviously in the news very publicly with TSB over the last 24, 48 hours, huge issues in trying to manage the continuity of service as well as threat. Okay, so I talked about digital technologies burning boundaries. I'm sure we're all very familiar with what these technologies are, but just to recap, every single one of these exposes our organization to increased threats. So I've talked about cloud. In terms of mobility, we all have phones, we all use and consume services readily on that device. That's now second nature. All of these technologies will expose and increase the threat landscape, the threat vectors within the organization. We don't have a choice not to use them. So we crossed that Rubicon. We have to embrace these technologies and keep delivering better outcomes. Okay, so I wanted to go to the second case study, which is healthcare. And one of the technologies on that previous screen was Internet of Things, or Internet of Threats, perhaps, is a better description. We know that there is a huge explosion in connected devices, embedded technology, and what better example than healthcare? You have the promise of improved patient outcomes, remote monitoring of patient activity, medicine as a service. All of these types of developments offer huge potential gains to the patient experience. But equally, we found, and this is a study that we did in Norway, X number of records, 1,500 devices processing data that were connected to the internet. Now, that's a scary prospect, isn't it? If those records are breached, we all hold our patient data, our patient confidentiality very seriously. But the risk, as we embrace further digitization and transformation, that those records will end up in the public domain is huge. So we need to have a better strategy of addressing that. Okay, so in summary, so I've talked about transformation. Let's now get to some of the reality in terms of the cyber threat that we're seeing. But we have, in summary, new points of weakness. We don't really know where the perimeter exists in our organization anymore. It can change. So we've just got this vastly expanded threat landscape to think about. I talked about third-party risk. I'm sure that we all need to embrace those relationships as we move forward. So hopefully I've made that point very clear. And I think, the other thing here in terms of skills, we know that there is a huge shortage of skills in this market. Technology in and of itself is not the only answer. It is about people, process, and tooling. And the skills issues that we have, that we all face, are very real. And there is a market both for the good and the bad. So the worst cyber criminals could also be the best people at helping solve some of these problems. How do we make sure that we have people fighting on the side of, the right side of that equation? And how do we make sure that we get practitioners into this field who can add value and produce better outcomes for us? And equally, the regulator, by the way, has similar challenges. They're competing for those skills as well. There was a lot of pressure on the regulators, particularly with GDPR, to bring people to book, to find a scalp, to find some sort of example, but do they necessarily have all the resources and the skills to do that? It's another variable that we need to think about. Okay, so what does the threat landscape look at? Now, some of you may well be familiar with this pyramid. Sometimes I've used it in an inverted fashion. Boris Johnson, I call it my Boris slide, the inverted pyramid of piffle, but this time it's the right way up. And the point I want to make here is really the sort of hierarchy of what we see in the threat landscape. So the broad base at the bottom of this pyramid, the 90%, is really the indiscriminate attacks, opportunistic threat. We could all become and fall victim to these threats, and that's the traditional market of cybercrime, if you like, the comfort zone for many of the cyber criminals out there. Moving up the stack to the 9.9, you then see much more targeted and focused attacks. So, for example, on critical infrastructure, these are the types of industries that will lend themselves to the criminals really want to go after them in a very, very targeted way. And we've got plenty of case studies of APTs and so forth that we track in this market. And at the very top of the pyramid, the cyber weaponry piece, this is one of the trends that we've seen in the market. It is the militarization of cyber threat. You have, going back, looking at Stuxnet a number of years ago, I suppose the very first instance of nation-state activity. So using cyber warfare to, further your state interests. So in that case, that was to do with nuclear technology in Iran. So what you see, importantly, in this pyramid is really a trickle down of threat. So the tools, the technologies that are used at the very apex of that pyramid, and we track about 100 advanced persistent threats at any one point in time. The point is, you then see those being recycled further down in that pyramid. So there is a trickle down here. And in many ways, in your organization, you are trying to catch a falling knife. You're trying to make sure that you have all of the people, process, and technologies at each stage of this pyramid to protect you and to make sure that you can pick up threat before it happens. So at the very base of that pyramid, we have traditional signature-based detection. And many talk about the fact that that market is commoditized. May well be. But in the context of the numbers that you're looking at, the detection rate is absolutely critical on the endpoint. The difference between at the margin, finding 99.1% or 99.6% of the threat that comes into your organization is key. So it's important that we have that tooling, the best-in-class tooling at every point of this pyramid. So this is what the threat landscape looks like. And at some point, we may well have people targeting us already in our organization, understanding our behavior, mimicking our behavior to the extent that we don't know that they're in. Nobody wants to look like a victim. If the windows are being rattled, how do you know if it is somebody that you have granted trust to come into your organization because they're a partner of yours, or whether that's a genuine threat that has now come through the door and you need to react to. So just focusing on that very top of the apex of the pyramid there, the 0.1%, it sounds like a small number, but our research shows that the impact of that is actually huge, to the tune of $1.2 million for that targeted attack. Now that's not even really taking into account opportunity cost lost, business, some of the reputational impact, but just the money that it will cost you to devote resources to address that threat. And what you see moving left from right is really how that spikes, and the risk level as time goes on, and as the nature of the threat becomes more persistent in your organization, will really bank towards the right of that chart. Okay, so that's the point one. But the reality is, and as Matt said, I think everyone's a target, and we've probably already been breached. We don't know it. Our data and research have shown that 1 in 4 businesses have been hit by attacks. When you look at the average UK business, on average, 1,000 attacks a day is one of the statistics that I've heard. So really, it's not about whether you have been. It's about, if you haven't already and you don't know it, you are going to be breached. So what do you do to prepare yourself and give yourself the best chance of avoiding being that target? So I think a couple of reality checks. I think a lot of us in this room, a bad day at the office is when you don't find something, because you know that constantly you are being breached. So if you find them, you know that you probably achieved what you wanted to that day. But the reality is, and this point about not wanting to look like a victim, how do you differentiate between some of the generic incidents which may create a false positive and some of the more serious and malicious threats in your organization? 50% of businesses say that they can't do that. We have this plethora of alerting. How do we make sure that we set the thresholds at the right level? As I say, to make sure that people we are wanting to come into our business are there because they have a reason to be, and we're satisfied that that's the right thing. Cost of delay in terms of detection. It's important that, from a regulatory point of view, if you are breached, you've got to be thinking about the forensic capability you need in your organization to satisfy the needs of the regulator. We know that with GDPR, you have 72 hours now to notify the regulator. But this is important in terms of also taking the learning from that experience and feeding it back into your security posture and policies as you move forward. So that's also going to be important. And in terms of not knowing how to respond to an attack, the National Audit Office, when they published their, a couple of occasions now, findings into the ransomware outbreaks last year, made some simple points around patching, around what we can do to better protect ourselves. But I think for me, one of the key learnings from that was the coordination that you need in terms of incident response. So how do you get the stakeholders in the business together across risk, across compliance, across the traditional IT infrastructure to make sure that you have a coordinated response and you're able to, as I say, mobilize effectively? Because really that was what happened with the NHS last year, an inability because of a lack of a plan to keep frontline services going. Okay, so what's the sort of call to action? What do we need to do differently? So we're doing this transformation. We understand the threat landscape is continually evolving, but what do we need to do to better protect ourselves at a very practical level? And one of our, I suppose, consistent messages is that security is really a continuous process. You have, with business transformation and digital transformation, an opportunity to put security right at the heart of what you do within your business process. It is the biggest single leadership challenge, I think, that we all have. How do I continue to go on this journey of transformation, digitization, and manage the risk that I have at the same time? And putting security right at the heart of that process is key. So it's not a project. I know that many of you in this room as practitioners will be acutely aware of that, and I'm sure I've been delivering that message for a number of years to your colleagues, but we really need to rethink how we continually improve and continually invest in the right people, process, and technology. So really just looking at the bottom of this, it's about, I've talked about having visibility, line of sight across that pyramid, being alive to all the threat and its various incarnations that you might see in an organization. It's also about having continual monitoring, being threat hunting, having a threat hunting approach to what we do rather than being reactive. We need to proactively find the threat in our organizations and be alive to the opportunity of finding them. And then making sure that we have contextual information and market-specific data to help really understand the nature of that threat and what it means to our business. Because there is no one template for transformation, and equally there is no one template for any industry vertical. I've talked about FS and healthcare, two very different markets, obviously. They need to have content-relevant, market-specific information to help counter that threat. So again, it is the people, process, and the technology. And the proactivity in terms of detection and response. Putting all these things together, really this is a key part of the message that we're delivering to the market right now. I'm aware of time, and I want to leave a little bit of time for questions if there are any. I think, Matt, I've got about 10 minutes. 5, okay. So, just in summary, I think, the importance of intelligence cannot be, underestimated. We need to have much more investment in information at the right time, context, industry relevant information in conjunction with the right tooling in our organization. And we need to, as I say, this kind of arms race that we see, we know that that threat landscape is continually evolving. Getting access to that intelligence, getting access to the best in breed, best of class technology is critical. And I think as a community collaboration, just looking at the numbers that we have here today, later today I'm going to Manchester to speak at the IP Expo, there is huge interest in this topic, and I think we have reached that tipping point now as a market sector, where there is real acute awareness of some of the threat and our need to start collaborating and sharing information. So that really is my message. You're on that journey of transformation. We've been in this business for 20 years. We're fortunate to have really capable market-leading partners like ProBrand and others to help us take this message to clients, because nobody gets paid extra for trying to do it on their own, right? Let's make sure that we work collectively. Let's make sure that we take advantage of the knowledge that we have in this industry and work together to actively become threat hunters. So that's really the key takeaway. We all need to be threat hunters now, and we're here to help. So thank you very much for your time. I've really enjoyed the opportunity to speak to you this morning, and happy to take some questions.
Nice.
Unless I answered every question.
I'll throw one very quickly if I could. I found it fascinating to learn about the
oh, there's one at the back.
Oh, apologies.
Hi. Good morning.
I'm not get used to this. Good morning, all. Just a couple of points, simple questions. The first one, you mentioned in your good presentation about the evolving of customer demands. Could you please elaborate a little bit more? And I would like to understand it from my point of view as an end user. And the second point, you also mentioned that in 2017, 1 in 4 businesses faced attacks. What is the resource of this? Where from this information?
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you very much.
So 2 parts to the question. So I'll take the last part first. In terms of that data, that's from our own Kaspersky Lab research. So we have significant research and development organization who track cyber threat, produce intelligence reporting. So that comes from our own primary research. Happy to share details separately on that. And in terms of the first part of your question, if I'm correct, you were talking about as a user. Yeah, I think the customer demands, as I say, in the 2 case studies that I was talking about specifically, in financial services, we want to have more flexibility in terms of how we consume those services, a better customer experience, a better outcome. Anyone who banks with TSB certainly hasn't had that over the last, I'm not saying that's necessarily a cyber threat, but certainly hasn't had that, let me just be clear. Or if it is, that's not on record. But I think, the need for that improved service, the globally competitive market that we have, that's what's driving the need to have better outcomes and experience. So balancing that customer experience with how do you make sure that you have better protection is the key. And I think as end users within all of our businesses and organizations, the key cultural change that needs to happen is we all need to be custodians. We need to have a sense of ownership in terms of how we are alive to threat. Whether that's social engineering and phishing, innocuous looking emails that actually hold something very malicious. We see those attacks, those types of techniques being employed on a very regular basis. I hope that answers your question. All right, thanks, Matt.
Cheers.